Captain Marcus Johnson felt an unusual mix of calm and curiosity as he settled into his first-class seat. This was no ordinary flight. It was a rare opportunity for the seasoned pilot to experience the other side of the cabin door. Today, he wasn't in uniform or commanding a crew, just Marcus, dressed in casual jeans and a neatly pressed button-down shirt, blending effortlessly with the other travelers. The transcontinental flight from New York to Los Angeles promised a few hours of peace, far from the pressures of the cockpit. Marcus leaned back into the supple leather of his seat, the faint scent of polished wood and luxury air freshener filling the cabin. The weight of the humid New York summer still clung to him, a thin sheen of sweat on his brow reminding him of the bustling terminal he'd just left behind. From his carry-on, he pulled a worn paperback copy of The Right Stuff, its edges frayed from years of use. The irony wasn't lost on him, a pilot reading about aviation's pioneers while someone else steered the ship. For once, he could sit back and enjoy the ride, leaving the sky in another pilot's hands. As passengers filed past, Marcus felt the familiar flicker of curiosity in their eyes. In 2024, seeing a black man in first class still caused more than a few second glances. He'd seen it throughout his career, his competence as a pilot questioned more often than his peers. But today, Marcus chose to ignore it. Today was about being just another passenger, or so he thought. A flight attendant named Sarah approached with a professional air, her blonde hair neatly pinned into a polished bun. Her smile was warm enough to pass as genuine, but didn't quite reach her sharp blue eyes. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her voice carrying a practiced calm. "I believe there may have been a mistake with your seating assignment. May I see your boarding pass?" Marcus, caught off guard, paused before handing over his ticket. He watched as Sarah scrutinized the slip of paper, her brow knitting in faint confusion. Her gaze darted between Marcus and the boarding pass, her composure growing tighter with every glance. "Sir, I'm sorry," she said, her tone sliding into one of polite insistence. "But this ticket is for first class. Unfortunately, there seems to have been an error. I'll need to ask you to move to economy." Marcus froze, disbelief and irritation colliding within him. He'd dealt with moments like this before, but here, in the very cabin he was finally able to enjoy as a passenger, it felt like a personal affront. "An error?" he repeated, his voice measured but firm. "This is my assigned seat. Are you certain the issue isn't with your system?" Her smile tightened. "There's no issue with the system," she replied. "However, this section is reserved for premium passengers." The unspoken implication hung heavy in the air, each word dripping with the subtle prejudice Marcus knew all too well. He inhaled deeply, holding back the surge of anger threatening to spill over. Years of navigating such moments had taught him that losing composure only fed the assumptions behind them. "I assure you," he said, steady and deliberate, "this is my correct seat. Perhaps your supervisor could assist us in clearing this up." Sarah's lips pursed, her calm demeanor beginning to fray. "I'm the lead flight attendant," she said tersely, "and I need you to gather your belongings so we can proceed with boarding the other passengers." By now, the interaction had drawn the attention of nearby travelers. Heads turned, hushed whispers passing between rows. Marcus could feel the weight of their gazes, curiosity, discomfort, and judgment swirling around him like an invisible storm. For a brief moment, he considered compliance, letting the moment pass for the sake of peace. But the sting of injustice struck deeper than his desire for a quiet flight. He spoke again, his voice steady but laced with quiet defiance. "I'll move," he said, reaching for his bag, "but I'd like to speak with the captain before this plane leaves the ground." Sarah nodded, visibly relieved, as Marcus rose from his seat and collected his belongings. She moved on to assist another passenger, unaware that her decision had set into motion a series of events that would challenge not just her assumptions, but those of everyone on board. Marcus navigated the narrow aisle, his carry-on in hand, his every step feeling heavier than the last. Each row he passed seemed to echo with whispers, stolen glances, and averted gazes. Some passengers offered him stiff, awkward smiles, while others buried their attention in their phones or magazines, unwilling to engage. The quiet humiliation clung to him like a second skin. Finally, he reached the cramped confines of economy class and found himself assigned to a middle seat near the back. Gone was the spacious elegance of first class, replaced by the tight quarters of coach. With a deep sigh, Marcus adjusted his tall frame into the narrow seat, his knees brushing against the tray table in front of him. Resigned but far from defeated, he stared ahead, the low hum of the cabin doing little to soothe his simmering frustration. Across the aisle, a young boy peered at Marcus with open curiosity, his wide eyes blinking in wonder. His mother noticed and gently nudged him back into his seat, whispering, "It's not polite to stare." Marcus managed a tired but kind smile in the boy's direction, though his mind was racing with thoughts of the injustice he'd just experienced. Pulling out his phone, Marcus began drafting an email to the airline's customer service department. Every word was measured, each sentence capturing the indignity of the situation without straying into unnecessary anger. He didn't expect immediate action, but he believed in leaving a record, a paper trail that could lead to accountability. The last passengers trickled aboard, and snippets of conversation from first class floated back to his ears. Words like mix-up and mistake danced on the edge of his hearing, each one laced with unspoken judgment. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to remain calm as he waited for the next move in this unanticipated drama. Then, the overhead speaker crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Welcome aboard Flight 972, nonstop to Los Angeles. We'll be taxiing shortly, so please make sure all carry-on items are stowed and your seatbelts are securely fastened." Marcus froze. The voice was familiar, not just because it carried the commanding tone of an airline captain, but because it belonged to someone he knew very well. His pulse quickened as he realized what was about to happen. The voice on the intercom was unmistakable, calm, confident, and commanding. Marcus's heart skipped a beat as recognition set in. Captain James Edwards, the man guiding this flight, was more than just a colleague. He was a friend, a mentor, and one of the few people in Marcus's life who had truly understood the obstacles he faced in aviation. It was Edwards who had pushed Marcus to persevere during the tough times, to believe in his own abilities even when the world seemed determined to undermine them. The situation carried a biting irony that Marcus couldn't ignore. Here he was, shuffled to the back of the plane by someone making snap judgments, while one of his greatest champions sat in the cockpit. The contrast stung, but it also gave him a renewed sense of purpose. As the plane began to taxi, Marcus weighed his options. Confronting Edwards would require tact. This wasn't just about his own dignity. It was about addressing a pattern of behavior that extended far beyond one flight or one attendant. Yet Marcus also knew the importance of not escalating unnecessarily. He resolved to proceed with care, guided by the principles that had carried him through years of adversity. Before he could finalize his plan, Sarah returned, her polished exterior showing small cracks. Her eyes briefly flicked to the phone in Marcus's hand before snapping back to his face. She seemed to brace herself as if anticipating confrontation. "Is there anything else I can do for you, sir?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral but tinged with an edge of irritation. Marcus regarded her evenly. "Yes, actually," he said, his tone calm but resolute. "I'd like to speak with the captain when he has a moment." Sarah hesitated, her composure faltering just slightly. "The captain is very busy preparing for takeoff," she replied, though Marcus detected the faintest quiver in her voice. "I understand," he said, holding her gaze. "I'll wait." Her lips pressed together in a thin line, and she gave a curt nod before walking away, her movements stiff and mechanical. Marcus could tell that she wasn't just reluctant, she was nervous. She likely knew that her actions, once illuminated in the captain's light, might not hold up under scrutiny. Marcus leaned back in his cramped seat, watching Sarah disappear into the first-class cabin. He wasn't looking for revenge, but he also wasn't willing to let this slide. This moment wasn't just about him. It was about a larger truth, and soon that truth would find its way to the surface. The engines roared as the plane soared into the sky, the familiar pull of gravity giving way to the smooth ascent. Marcus leaned back in his seat, his eyes closed momentarily, grounding himself in the rhythmic hum of the aircraft. This wasn't the first time he'd faced such indignities, but the sting of this incident was sharper, more personal. It wasn't just about a seat. It was about years of proving his worth in a world too quick to dismiss him. When the plane leveled off and the cabin settled into its mid-flight calm, Sarah reappeared, her earlier composure visibly shaken. She approached Marcus hesitantly, her voice low as though she feared being overheard. "Captain Edwards would like to see you," she said, her eyes darting away from his. Marcus unbuckled his seatbelt. Without a word, rising to his feet. The quiet tension in the cabin followed him as he moved toward the front, passengers' gazes lingering on him as he passed. He ignored their curiosity, his focus narrowing as he approached the cockpit. Captain James Edwards stood just outside the cockpit door, his posture relaxed, but his expression shifting the moment he spotted Marcus. Surprise flickered across his face, followed quickly by concern. "Marcus," Edwards said, his voice carrying the warm familiarity of years spent working together. "What on earth are you doing back here?" Marcus stopped in front of him, arms crossed, a tight smile barely concealing the frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "I could ask you the same thing, Captain," Marcus replied, his tone calm but edged with quiet reproach. Edwards turned to Sarah, who had trailed awkwardly behind, her discomfort written all over her face. "Sarah," Edwards said evenly, his tone polite but with an undercurrent of authority, "could you give us a moment, please?" Sarah nodded quickly, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment as she retreated toward the galley. Once she was out of earshot, Edwards turned back to Marcus, his blue eyes scanning his friend's face. "What happened?" he asked, his voice tinged with both concern and disbelief. Marcus took a slow breath before replying. "Let's just say your lead flight attendant has some interesting ideas about who belongs in first class." Marcus watched as Edward's hand hovered over the intercom, the weight of the decision etched on his face. The captain's determination was clear, but Marcus wasn't sure a public announcement was the right way to handle it, not yet. "James," Marcus said, his voice steady but firm, "before you do that, think about what you're trying to achieve. This isn't just about making a statement, it's about ensuring this moment leads to real change. A public announcement might put Sarah on the defensive or escalate the situation unnecessarily." Edwards paused, lowering his hand. "You're right," he said, nodding slowly. "We need to handle this carefully." Marcus leaned forward, his tone softening. "Start by addressing it with Sarah directly. Make sure she understands what went wrong and why. Then work with your team to make systemic changes. Training, awareness, whatever it takes. This can't just be a one-time conversation." Edwards sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You always did have a way of seeing the bigger picture," he said with a faint smile. "But you shouldn't have had to deal with this in the first place. I'm still going to make it right, Marcus. Not just for you, but for everyone else who's had to endure this kind of treatment." Marcus gave a small nod of appreciation. "That's all I'm asking." Edwards stood, his resolve clear. "I'll start with Sarah, and I'll escalate it to the airline leadership once we're on the ground. You have my word." As the captain opened the cockpit door, Marcus prepared to return to his seat. But before stepping out, Edwards turned back. "Thank you for speaking up," he said sincerely. "Your voice is going to make a difference." Marcus smiled faintly, the weight in his chest lifting just slightly. "Let's hope so," he replied. Then with a deep breath, he walked back down the aisle, feeling the curious eyes of passengers on him once more. This time, however, the burden felt a little lighter. Marcus turned to face Sarah, her pale expression a stark contrast to the confidence she'd displayed earlier. Her trembling hands betrayed the weight of the moment, and her gaze flickered between him and Edwards, struggling to settle. Sarah began again, her voice faltering. She swallowed hard before continuing, her words slow and deliberate. "I want to apologize for how I treated you earlier. It was wrong, and there's no excuse for it." Marcus studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. He could sense the discomfort radiating from her, the realization of her own bias beginning to sink in. It wasn't an easy thing to face, and part of him respected the courage it took for her to stand there now. "Sarah," Marcus said evenly, his tone calm but firm, "I appreciate the apology. But it's not just about what happened to me today. This is about the assumptions you made, the ones people like me deal with all the time. What matters is how you choose to move forward from here." She nodded quickly, her eyes glistening with emotion. "You're right," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do better. I'll learn from this." Edward stepped in, his voice steady and supportive. "Sarah, acknowledging it is the first step. But understanding why it happened and ensuring it doesn't happen again is where the real work begins. This isn't just about one mistake. It's about creating a better culture for everyone." Sarah nodded again, her shoulders slumping slightly as she exhaled, the tension visibly leaving her body. "Thank you," she said quietly, looking at Marcus. "And I'm truly sorry." Marcus offered her a small nod. "Thank you for saying that. Now it's about action." As Sarah stepped away, the energy in the cockpit shifted. Edwards looked back at Marcus, his expression resolute. "You ready to head back?" he asked. Marcus nodded, straightening his posture. "Yeah, I think I am." As Marcus walked back through the cabin, the whispers had turned into a hum of respect. Passengers who had previously averted their gazes now looked up, some nodding in silent acknowledgement. For the first time in a long while, Marcus felt seen, not as a problem, but as a person deserving of respect and dignity. Settling into his seat, Marcus gazed out the window at the endless expanse of sky. The sting of the day's event still lingered, but so did the glimmer of something more. A hope that maybe, just maybe, the world could begin to change, one small step at a time. The boy's face lit up with a bright, unfiltered joy at Marcus's words. His little fingers gripped the toy airplane tightly, as though holding on to his dreams just as firmly. Behind him, his mother smiled, her expression a mix of gratitude and pride. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice tinged with emotion, "for being someone he can look up to." Marcus nodded, his heart full. "It's my pleasure," he replied, his voice warm. "And if he ever wants advice, tell him to find me up there in the skies." The boy beamed and waved as his mother gently guided him back to their seats. Marcus turned back to his own, a new sense of purpose settling over him. The sting of the earlier incident hadn't disappeared, but moments like this reminded him why it was worth pushing through the hardships, worth speaking up, and worth being visible. The rest of the flight passed with an air of quiet reverence. Passengers seemed more introspective, the weight of the captain's announcement and Sarah's apology hanging in the cabin. Marcus noticed the flight attendants moving through the aisles with a slightly different energy, as though striving to be more present, more aware. As the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, Marcus allowed himself to exhale fully. This flight had started as an ordinary trip, but transformed into something far greater, a challenge, a lesson, and most importantly, an opportunity for change. When the plane finally touched down and the seatbelt sign clicked off, passengers began gathering their belongings. Several paused to offer Marcus small nods or murmurs of support as they passed. The older woman who had spoken earlier stopped again, placing a hand gently on his arm. "You've given a lot of people something to think about today," she said, her eyes twinkling. "Thank you for that." Marcus smiled, the words settling warmly in his chest. "Thank you for saying that," he replied. As he exited the plane, Sarah was stationed at the door, her posture nervous but resolute. When Marcus approached, she met his gaze squarely. "Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice steady now, "thank you for your grace today. I'll make sure this doesn't happen again. Not just for you, but for anyone." Marcus regarded her for a moment before offering a small smile. "That's all I ask," he said simply. Stepping onto the jet bridge, Marcus felt the California sun streaming through the windows, a lightness in his steps that hadn't been there before. The journey wasn't over, not by a long shot, but today had been a victory, and that was enough for now. The skies were vast, infinite, and open to all who dared to claim them, and Marcus knew he'd continue to fight to make sure they stayed that way. Helen's eyes narrowed slightly as she took in Marcus's expression, her brow furrowing with quiet concern. "Something happened on that flight, didn't it?" she asked softly, her voice laced with both curiosity and a touch of worry. Marcus exhaled, the weight of the day catching up to him. "Yeah, Mom," he admitted, his tone steady but reflective. "Something did, but I think—" He paused, searching for the right words. "I think it might lead to something bigger, something good." Helen tilted her head, her gaze warm but probing. "Tell me." As they found a quiet spot in the terminal to sit, Marcus recounted the day's events. The initial humiliation, the captain's bold intercom announcement, Sarah's apology, and the unexpected email from the journalist. Helen listened intently, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression shifting from shock to pride as Marcus spoke. When he finished, Helen reached over and placed a hand on his. "You've always had a way of turning obstacles into opportunities," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I know it wasn't easy, but you stood your ground. That matters, Marcus. More than you know." Marcus smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Thanks, Mom," he said softly. I don't know if I'm ready to take this public. Talking to that journalist, it could bring a lot of attention, and not all of it will be positive." Helen squeezed his hand, gently. "The choice is yours, son. But remember, sometimes the hardest stories to tell are the ones that most need to be heard. If you feel ready, tell it. If not, that's okay too. What you've done today is already enough." Marcus nodded, her words settling in his chest. The terminal buzzed with the noise of travelers, but for a moment, it felt like it was just the two of them in their own little world. "I'll think about it," he said finally. "But no matter what, I'll keep pushing for change." Helen smiled, her eyes shimmering with pride. "That's my boy," she said, "always reaching for the skies." As they stood to leave, Marcus glanced down at his phone again, the email still open. He wasn't sure what his answer would be yet, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of possibility, a belief that his voice, his story, and his experiences might truly make a difference. With his mother by his side, Marcus walked out into the cool Los Angeles air, the horizon stretching wide and full of potential. Today had been just one flight, but he knew it was part of a much bigger journey, one that was only just beginning. Helen noticed the shift in Marcus as they walked, her keen eyes catching the subtle determination in his stride. She didn't press him further, knowing her son well enough to let him process the moment on his own. Instead, she gave his arm a gentle pat, a silent reassurance that she was there, as she had always been. Marcus glanced at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "You know," he said, his tone lighter now, "you always seem to know the right thing to say." "That's what moms are for," Helen replied with a wink, her own smile radiating warmth. "Besides, I raised you to stand tall, didn't I?" "You did," Marcus admitted, his voice touched with gratitude. "And today, I needed to remember that." As they exited the terminal, the cool Los Angeles breeze met them, cutting through the tension that had gripped Marcus for much of the day. The city stretched out before him, alive with possibilities, its lights flickering against the fading daylight. Checking his phone again, Marcus reread his reply to Olivia Clark. The decision to share his story felt monumental, but also necessary. He knew that speaking up might open him to criticism, but it also offered a chance to inspire, to shed light on the quiet battles people like him fought every day. Helen glanced at the screen over his shoulder, catching a glimpse of the email. "So," she said, her voice casual but curious, "you're going to tell your story?" Marcus nodded, slipping his phone back into his pocket. "Yeah," he said, "it's time." Helen's smile widened, pride shining through her every feature. "Good," she said. "The world needs to hear it." As they reached the curb and waited for their ride, Marcus felt a newfound sense of clarity. Today had been hard, humiliating at points, but it had also been transformative. He wasn't just stepping off a plane, he was stepping into a new chapter of his life, one where his voice carried the weight of his experiences and the hope for a better future. For the first time in a long time, Marcus felt grounded, not just in who he was, but in what he could achieve. The sky was vast, limitless, and open, and he was ready to claim his place in it. Because as his mother had said, he was stronger than they knew, and he was just getting started.